Hello there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam FPP and Sunbeam Fabric Art. Hey, today we're going to take a look at this pattern I developed. It's a quarter of a Celtic knot. So I decided I only needed to develop a quarter and then I could put 4 quarters together to make the full Celtic knot. I only need 2 colors to make this block. I'm using black for my background and I'm going to use a gold print for my gold knot. I am going to try my best to chain piece or do these 4 at a time, adding the pieces 4 at a time, doing each piece, each section 4 at a time, and see how that goes. So what you see me doing here is I'm cutting out some black pieces for this piece, this section of the pattern, and I'm making sure I cut out 4, making sure they're going to fit over that space of the individual piece with room to spare for seam allowances. As I cut out the pieces, I'm stacking them up in the order I'm going to be sewing them in, and if I go large to small, all I have to do is flip my stack over the opposite way. When it's time to cut out print fabrics, if you're matching up the sizes to your pattern, and you've got a reverse pattern, which all my patterns are reverse images because we're sewing on the back. So when we flip it over, right side up is the back of the pattern. What I want to do is line up my fabric wrong side up with the pattern to make sure it's going to fit. Now on this long rectangle it doesn't really matter, but on some of the angled pieces it will definitely matter. Once I get the fabric pieces cut out for each of the sections, I do set my piece of paper on top of the fabric. This way I keep everything in order, and when everything is cut out, I'm ready to go to the sewing machine and just start stitching. If you want to skip ahead to the next chapter, you are welcome to. I'm going to go slow on this first little bit of paper piecing in case you want to see how I'm doing it. I need the piece for H1 and H2, and I need to make sure I'm going to put those right sides together. Then I'm going to line them up on the back of my paper, making sure that where they join is going to overlap that stitch line. The line between H1 and H2 is a stitch line. I'm going to sew directly on that line, and I'm going to be using a 1.3 stitch length. For every addition, I like to take the time to trim the threads, fold back the paper on the stitch line, trim away excess bulk, and then I will press that seam open. I'm doing 4 of each quarter knot pattern. That way I can put all 4 together to make one complete Celtic knot. Now it's time to add the third piece, and what I'm doing here is I'm putting my gold fabric right sides together on the back, and I want to make sure it's angled correctly, and I want to make sure it's overlapping the stitch line, and then when it folds open it will completely cover H3. If you want to see where the exact 1/4 inch line would be, you can fold on your stitch line before you add the fabric, fold back on that stitch line and trim away to exactly a 1/4 inch. Then it's a lot easier to place your fabric. As long as I can see through what I'm doing or fold back the paper to see that I have that overlap, I don't really worry about that part of it, but the link I have in this video description, they will show you how to do that method where you fold on the stitch line before you stitch, lay your ruler down, give yourself that 1/4 inch seam allowance, trim away the fabric, then you have a nice straight edge to line up your fabric. Now it's time to add piece H4, which is a little tiny triangle. Pretty easy to put on. I just cut out some pieces that I thought were big enough, and I am going to be stitching those again, overlapping that H4 stitch line so that when I fold this open, it will cover the entire piece H4 plus the seam allowance on the side there. I did want to demonstrate on this piece H7. I was having a little trouble seeing through for the fabric, so I'm folding on that stitch line and I'm going ahead and trimming away about a 1/4 of an inch or a little bit less. Now I have a nice straight edge and I can line up my rectangle for piece H7 right along that cut I just made. Here is a look at my 4 completed H sections. Now I just have to do A through G, and also there's a section I. The more I did, the easier it got to chain these individual sections and pieces. I did go ahead and stitch the rest of these sections A through G, and now I'm ready to trim these sections. For longer sections, I like to trim with a ruler and a rotary cutter on my cutting mat, and I line up that 1/4 inch line with the stitch line, and the dotted line is what I'm cutting on. All my patterns are printed out with that seam allowance included, and they have a dotted line to indicate that seam allowance. With smaller pieces, sometimes I'll just use my scissors to trim on the dotted line. I did take advantage of chain trimming. As you can see here, I'm lining up 4 at a time and trimming them all together. Some of the sections have little notches on the corners. This is supposed to make it easier for you to line up this section with another section. So I usually just take my scissors and trim those if I can. Otherwise, I will keep them on the mat and use my rotary cutter to do that. Now it was time for me to lay out the knot, the 1/4 knot, into what it was supposed to look like. I'm testing my own pattern here that I designed, so I do need to lay it out and write out instructions on how to put the pieces together. It's pretty much like algebra. You have to do A plus B with parentheses around them. So put those together first, and then maybe add C, and then maybe you put E and F together and add it to what you just put together. So it is like high school algebra to me, which I liked. So I don't mind writing these patterns with algebra. Parentheses, pluses, and an equal sign is really all I need. By the time this video comes out, I will definitely have the pattern available on my Etsy shop. Now it's time to put my sections together in the order that I wrote down, and these particular 2 sections, they don't have anything that I need to match up. They're just going to get stitched together, right sides together, and there's nothing to match. Even if I'm not having to match, it's nice to clip and see that my straight edge is going to come out correctly. I'm going to continue putting my pieces together, and I will slow down when I have a section that needs to be matched with another section, and show you how I do that. Here's a look at clipping together a couple of sections to make sure that my gold fabric does line up. So trust the process and get your corners together on this one, and I'm going to clip right where those seams are, and clipping together and then opening this up. I can see that looks pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and stitch my line. Basic foundation paper piecing teaches us that you should leave the paper on until your block is complete and then remove all the paper. I find that in my more intricate advanced patterns that doesn't work out so well. I need to remove some paper as I go along. And the reason for that is there are so many tiny pieces in many of my patterns that you would just get bulky paper under there in layer after layer after layer. So I'm just very careful when I'm sewing. I remove the paper carefully to not rip the seams, and I sew very carefully to not stretch any bias edges. In this particular section, I removed paper from the seam allowance on one side, and then I left the paper on so I'd have that straight line to guide me as I stitched the seam. I continued putting these sections all together for my 4 quarter knots. At the end, when I had the 4 all done, I did remove all the paper, pressed these 4 quarters nice and flat, and then I just simply put the quarter knots together in a 4 patch. Once the paper is all gone, I do put my stitch length back to about a 2 to 2.4. My big Celtic knot came out to about 16 inches, and I decided to go ahead and quilt it. So I made my quilt sandwich, and I just started going in a spiral around from the inside to the outside of this knot. I pulled some green 2.5 inch strip fabric out of my stash, and I used that to bind this small quilt. I really like this Celtic knot pattern. I'm going to get that pattern finished up now and get it posted onto my Etsy page. Not sure what I'm going to do with this little mat. Maybe just have it as a table decoration. Let me know in the comments if you like this knot, and what would you do? Would you make a whole quilt out of it? Would it be the focal point for maybe a St. Patrick's Day type door hanging or wall hanging? Thanks so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you back again real soon.